Wake
Thomas
up!
Hartwell had been
You have to
riding
get
the
up!
high country for 12
We
years,
need to move now!
ever since his family had been killed in a Apache raid that left him as the sole survivor. He had learned to prefer the company of mountains to the company of people, and his ranch stretched across 10,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving terrain in Wyoming. The blizzard that hit on November 15th was the worst Thomas had seen since arriving in the territory. Snow fell for 3 days and nights, driven by winds that could knock a man off his horse and temperatures that could freeze a person's blood in their veins. Thomas was well prepared for such weather, with supplies and shelter that could last him through a month of confinement. But the sound that reached his ears on the morning of the 4th day was not the silence of a world buried under snow. It was something that made his blood run cold, a woman's voice calling for help, drifting through the howling wind like a prayer. Thomas was not the kind of man who ignored cries for assistance, regardless of his preference for solitude. He pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed his emergency supplies, and set out into the storm to find whoever was trapped in conditions that could kill a person in minutes. The sound led him to a ravine 2 miles from his house, where he found her. A young woman, barely out of her teens, wearing a thin dress and a coat that had been patched too many times to provide any real protection against the cold. She was huddled against a rock wall, her lips blue with cold, and her eyes barely focused. "Please," she whispered when she saw him. "I'm lost. I've been walking for 2 days." Thomas knelt beside her, checking her pulse and examining her condition. She was alive, barely, but hypothermia had already begun its work on her system. More immediately concerning was the fact that she was severely overweight, which meant that the cold was affecting her differently than it would someone with less padding. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently, pulling off his own coat to wrap around her shivering form. "Martha. Martha Whitcomb," she managed through chattering teeth. "I was trying to get to my aunt's place in Rawlins. I ran away from home and I thought I could make it before the storm." The words told Thomas more than she realized. This was not a woman who had been kidnapped or lost due to bad luck. This was someone who had made a desperate choice to escape from something in her past, and who had been caught by weather that didn't care about her reasons for being in the mountains. "Can you walk?" he asked. Martha tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. The cold had sapped her strength, and her heavy frame, which might have been an advantage in some situations, was now a liability that made movement difficult. Thomas made a decision that would have been impossible for him to imagine just hours earlier. Instead of going back to his house for help, he lifted Martha into his arms and began carrying her toward shelter. She was heavy, very heavy, but Thomas had spent years working with cattle and carrying supplies up and down mountain trails. His strength was equal to the challenge. "Someone's looking for me," Martha whispered against his chest as he carried her through the deep snow. "My father. He said I brought shame to our family by being this size. He said I was worthless, that I should be hidden away like a shameful secret." Thomas felt something hot rise in his throat, not just compassion, but anger at a man who could look at a young woman and see only her physical flaws instead of her human worth. "Your father is wrong," he said firmly. "You're not worthless. You're a person, and people deserve to be treated with dignity." As they approached his house, Thomas was already planning what to do next. This girl needed medical attention, warm food, and a safe place to recover. But more than that, she needed to know that there were people in the world who would see her value as a human being. Thomas's house was built for practicality rather than comfort. 3 rooms with a stone fireplace, a well-stocked kitchen, and furniture that was sturdy rather than elegant. The main room was dominated by a large bed that had been built for Thomas's own considerable height and weight, but it was clear that Martha would need something different. "You can have the bed," Thomas told her as he tucked her under thick blankets. "I'll sleep on the couch." Martha looked at him with confusion. "But I take up a lot of space. I'm not small like other women." Thomas sat down in a chair beside the bed, his expression serious but kind. "Martha, I need to tell you something. I've lived alone for 12 years, and in that time, I've learned that size isn't what makes a person valuable. What makes a person valuable is their character, their kindness, and their willingness to treat others with respect." He leaned forward slightly, his voice growing more intense. "You risked your life to escape from a situation that was clearly terrible for you. That took courage. It doesn't matter how much you weigh. Courage is courage, and it's one of the rarest and most precious qualities a person can have." Martha stared at him in wonder. No one had ever talked to her about courage before. Her father had only ever mentioned her weight, her appearance, and her failures to be the daughter he had wanted. "What if I can't pay you back?" she asked. "I don't have any money. I don't have any skills that would be useful to someone who lives as far from town as you do." Thomas smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face completely. "The way I see it, the only payment I need is knowing that I didn't leave someone to die in the cold. Everything else is a bonus." As Martha drifted off to sleep, finally warm for the first time in days, she found herself thinking about this strange man who had saved her life, and seemed to see something in her that she had never seen in herself. Martha's recovery took longer than Thomas had expected, not because of any complications from the cold, but because she was so weak from malnutrition and the stress of her escape that it took weeks for her to regain her strength. During that time, Thomas learned more about his unexpected house guest than he had expected to know about anyone. "My father was a minister," Martha explained one afternoon as she sat by the fire, her color much improved but her energy still limited. "He believed that people should control their appetites, and he thought that my size showed a lack of moral discipline. He started locking me in my room when I was 15, saying that I needed to learn to control myself." Thomas listened with growing anger. "How long were you locked up?" 3 years. I only got out when my aunt offered to take me in. But the journey was too long, and I got lost in the storm." Martha's voice was matter-of-fact, but Thomas could hear the pain beneath the words. "I think my father was happy to see me go. He always said I brought shame to his congregation." Thomas had heard enough. "Martha, what your father did to you was wrong. No one has the right to imprison another person, regardless of their weight or appearance. And shame is not something that can be justified by calling it religious duty." Over the following days, Thomas made it his mission to help Martha rebuild both her physical strength and her emotional confidence. He taught her to work in the kitchen, showing her that she had a natural talent for cooking that could be developed into real skills. He took her for short walks, helping her regain her mobility and learn to navigate the mountain terrain. "You have good instincts," he told her, as they worked together to repair some damage to the barn. "You think ahead, you plan your movements, and you don't make the same mistake twice. Those are qualities that make someone valuable, not the size of their waistline." For the first time in her life, Martha was being treated like a person, rather than like a problem that needed to be solved. As the weeks passed and Martha's strength returned, Thomas began to realize that having her in his house was changing his own life in ways he hadn't expected. For 12 years, he had been content with solitude, but now he found himself looking forward to the conversations they shared, the meals they prepared together, and the quiet companionship of someone who didn't require him to prove his worth through constant activity. "I've been thinking," Thomas said one evening, as they shared a dinner of Martha's venison stew, "about the business end of this operation. I'm good at working with animals and managing the land, but I'm not very good at the business side of things. The books, the correspondence with buyers, the negotiations with suppliers, it's all very tedious." Martha looked at him with interest. I was always good with numbers. I kept track of all the household expenses when I lived with my father, and I found ways to save money that he never would have thought of. The observation sparked an idea in Thomas's mind. What if we made this a real partnership? You could handle the business side of the ranch, and I could handle the day-to-day operations. Two people working together might be able to build something that neither of us could achieve alone. Martha's eyes went wide with surprise. You'd want to work with me? Not just tolerate me until I found somewhere else to go? Martha, Thomas said, his voice serious, I've been tolerating solitude for 12 years. What I want is partnership. I want someone who can think strategically, who understands that success in business requires both vision and attention to detail, and who doesn't mind putting in the hard work that makes prosperity possible. The idea was revolutionary for Martha, who had been taught that her only value lay in her appearance and her ability to be decorative rather than productive. The thought that someone could actually want her for her intelligence and abilities was almost too much to comprehend. The partnership began in earnest as spring approached, and Thomas's first test of Martha's capabilities came when he needed to negotiate a new contract with the railroad company that shipped his beef to market. The current contract was unfavorable, but Thomas had never been good at financial negotiations and was dreading the meeting. "Show me the terms," Martha said, studying the contract with the kind of focused attention that Thomas had never seen her use before. "And tell me what you think the fair market value of your cattle should be." What followed was a masterclass in business analysis that impressed Thomas more than he wanted to admit. Martha had clearly inherited her father's ability to analyze complex information. But she applied it to problems that actually mattered instead of using it to justify the cruel treatment of a family member. "If I were representing the railroad," she said after hours of study, "I would try to lock you into a long-term contract at current prices, knowing that beef prices are likely to rise over the next few years. But if you're willing to take a risk, you could negotiate a contract with an escalation clause that would protect you from price fluctuations." Thomas stared at her, amazed. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Martha shrugged, still not entirely comfortable with receiving praise. "I've always been good with numbers and logic. I just never had a chance to use those skills for something productive before." The negotiation that followed was successful beyond Thomas's expectations, resulting in a contract that would pay significantly more for his cattle while providing the railroad with the supply security they needed. Martha had not only earned her place as a business partner, she had proven that her value to the operation went far beyond simple companionship. The summer months were spent expanding and improving the ranch, with Martha's business acumen and Thomas's practical skills creating a partnership that was more effective than either of them had imagined. They added new buildings, expanded their herd, and began to attract attention from other ranchers who were curious about their unusual success. "You're doing something different," observed Jacob Miller, a neighboring rancher who had stopped by to see their operation firsthand. "Most small operations are struggling to survive, but yours seems to be thriving. What's your secret?" Thomas looked at Martha, who was conferring with their ranch hands about the new irrigation system they were installing. "The secret," he said, "is recognizing that a business partner is different from an employee. Martha doesn't just follow my orders, she helps me figure out what orders are worth giving." The observation was accurate and perceptive. Martha had not only proven herself as a business manager, but she had also demonstrated a capacity for leadership that Thomas had never encountered in any of his previous associates. "The real difference," Martha said when she joined the conversation, "is that Thomas doesn't try to hide his failures or pretend that running a ranch is easier than it actually is. Most people want to appear successful, even when they're not, which makes it impossible to learn from mistakes and improve performance." The conversation with Miller was typical of the growing interest in the Hartwell operation. Word was spreading that a small ranch was outperforming much larger operations, and people wanted to understand how that was possible. By autumn of their first year together, Thomas had realized that his feelings for Martha had evolved far beyond simple gratitude or business partnership. He was in love with her, not despite her size, but because of who she was as a person. Her intelligence, her determination, her ability to see solutions where he saw problems, and her absolute loyalty to people who earned her respect had made her indispensable to his life. The question was how to propose marriage to someone who had been told for most of her life that she was unlovable. Thomas knew that he couldn't simply assume that Martha would say yes, especially given her history with her father and the emotional scars that had been left by years of cruel treatment. "I've been thinking about the future," he said one evening as they sat by their fire, reviewing the books that showed their operation's impressive growth. "About what happens when we get too old to run this place ourselves." Martha looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to know what your goals are. Do you want to stay here? Or do you want to move somewhere else and start a new operation? Do you want to get married? Or do you prefer to remain independent? Those are all questions that have real answers, and I need to know what your answers are." The approach was more subtle than a traditional proposal, but it was more appropriate given Martha's history. She had been forced into a marriage she didn't want, and the thought of being pressured into another relationship would be deeply traumatic. Martha's response was thoughtful and revealing. "I've never really thought about the future because I never believed I had one. But since coming here, I've realized that I want to build something lasting. I want to prove that people like me can be successful, can be valued, can contribute something meaningful to the world." "And what about love?" Thomas asked gently. "Is that something you want? Or is it something you've learned to do without?" Martha looked at him with surprise. "Are you asking me if I love you?" "I'm asking if you think you could love someone," Thomas replied. "And if so, whether that someone could be me." Martha's response to Thomas's question was the most important conversation they had ever had. And it was also the most honest discussion about love and commitment that either of them had ever been able to have. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion she was feeling, "I have loved you from the moment you carried me out of the storm and told me I wasn't worthless. I love you for seeing me as a person instead of as a problem. I love you for trusting me with your business and your dreams. I love you for showing me that there are people in the world who believe in second chances." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "But I'm also afraid. I'm afraid that you might change your mind about loving me, that you might decide that I'm too much work, too much responsibility, too much of a burden. I've been taught that I'm a disappointment, and sometimes I still believe that lesson." Thomas reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Martha, I want to marry you not because I feel sorry for you, or because I think I need to save you. I want to marry you because you are the most remarkable person I've ever met, and because I believe that together we can build something beautiful and lasting." The proposal that followed was simple but profound. Thomas didn't offer Martha the kind of romantic fantasy that movies were made of. Instead, he offered her practical things that mattered in real life: partnership in building a business, respect for her abilities, loyalty during difficult times, and the kind of love that grows stronger through shared experience. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply. Martha's answer was immediate and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me is justified." The wedding took place in the spring, 6 months after Thomas's proposal, with a ceremony that was small but meaningful. The guest list included their ranch hands, a few neighboring families, and some of the business associates who had learned to respect both Martha's abilities and the unusual partnership she had created with Thomas. What impressed the wedding guests most was the bed that Thomas had built for their bedroom. It was not just large enough to accommodate Martha's size. though it was certainly that. It was also beautifully crafted, with headboard carvings that told the story of their relationship, and posts that were strong enough to last a lifetime. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Martha said when she first saw it. "Not just because it's big enough, but because you built it with your own hands. Thinking about me specifically." Thomas smiled as he showed her the details. The heart carved into the center of the headboard, the measurements that allowed for comfort regardless of their positions, and the strength that would support them through whatever years lay ahead. "I wanted to build you something that showed how much I value you," he said. "Not just your presence in my life, but your specific needs and your unique qualities. This bed represents everything I want to give you: comfort, strength, beauty, and the security of knowing that you're exactly where you belong." As they prepared for their wedding night, Martha realized that this was her first experience of being loved for who she was rather than despite what she was. Thomas had not only accepted her size, but had built his entire life around accommodating and celebrating it. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she whispered, as they settled into the bed that had been made especially for them. "Neither did I," Thomas replied, pulling her close. "But I think we've both learned that happiness comes from finding someone who sees your worth, not from trying to become someone else." The lone rancher who had found the obese girl freezing had indeed built her a bed sized for love. But he had given her much more than furniture. He had given her a future, a purpose, and the kind of acceptance that makes all other forms of success possible. And in the growing darkness of that spring evening, with the sound of wind through the pines and the promise of children and grandchildren and legacy hanging in the air, Thomas Hartwell and Martha Whitcomb. Hartwell knew that they had found exactly what they had been searching for without even knowing they were looking. The kind of love that sees beyond surface appearances to the essential worth of a human soul, and builds a life around the celebration of that worth rather than the denial of it. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,